There's a phrase that gets used so casually in so many offices, on so many LinkedIn headlines, that most of us have stopped actually hearing it. Human resources. Say it slowly for a second. Human resources. As if a person, once they walk through the door of a company, becomes something closer to lumber, or oil, or copper. A substance to be allocated, extracted from, and eventually depleted. Nobody designed that phrase to be sinister. It probably started as a bit of bureaucratic shorthand decades ago, and nobody sat in a room and thought, let's rename people after raw materials. But language has a way of quietly training us to think a certain way long before we notice it's happened. And I started wondering, what if that phrase isn't actually an accident of corporate jargon, but actually a pretty accurate description of how the whole system has come to see us? That's the question underneath everything I want to talk about today. Not why can't people find good jobs, although that's real. Not why does everyone feel so tired, although that's real too. The question underneath is stranger, I think, more important. What happens to a human being when an entire economic system starts treating them primarily as an input to be optimized rather than a person? Let's start with the productivity piece, because I think that's where the logic actually begins. At some point, probably in the last 50 years, almost every domain of work got quietly converted into a measurement problem. KPIs, output per hour, engagement metrics, conversion rates. None of these tools are evil in themselves. Measuring things is often how you improve. But here's what happened underneath the measuring. The moment you can quantify someone's output, you've created a very tempting shortcut. You can start treating the quantity as the person. Not how is this person doing, but what is this person producing? There's a phrase Kant used that I think is genuinely useful here, and I promise I won't turn this into a seminar. Kant argued that a human being should never be treated merely as means to an end, but always at the same time as the end. Simple version. A person is not just a tool for getting something else done. A person is the point. The moment an entire system starts optimizing itself so that people exist primarily to hit a number, that system has quietly inverted the relationship. The number becomes the point. The person becomes the tool for reaching it. And once you see that inversion, you start noticing it everywhere. Performance reviews that measure a year of human life in a 5-point scale, layoffs announced as resource optimization, a phrase that manages to make firing someone sound like defragmenting a hard drive, entire departments dedicated to human capital, another phrase worth pausing on, capital, the thing you invest and extract returns from. We didn't accidentally end up talking like this. We built a system that runs on this logic, and the language just followed the logic home. Keep that in the back of your mind. The idea of a person converted into an input, because it's going to connect at something that at first is going to sound like a totally separate topic, taxation. Stay with me here, because I don't want to turn this into a rant about tax rates and so on. That's not actually the interesting part. The interesting part is the structure of the thing. Think about the actual life cycle of a normal middle-class paycheck. You earn income, taxed. You spend that income on almost anything, taxed again. usually through sales tax or VAT. If you manage to save something and it grows even slightly, taxed again on the gains. If you eventually buy property with what's left, taxed again every single year, just for continuing to own it. Why did I buy it in the first place if I still need to pay for it? You see, at nearly every checkpoint where money changes states, earned, spent, grown, held, the state reaches and takes another slice. And by the time you add it all up, for an awful lot of working people, something close to half of what they generate never actually becomes theirs in any meaningful way. It passes through them on its way somewhere else. Now, and this matters, some of that is genuinely the price of a functioning society. Roads don't build themselves. Nobody wants to live in a country with no emergency services because taxis are unpopular. And you get the idea. But here's the yes, but even granting all of that, there's a difference between contributing to a system and being structurally unable to accumulate anything significant within your own lifetime because of how many times the same dollar gets touched on its way through your hands. And that's the feeling people are actually describing when they say the system is crushing them. It's not simply taxes are high. It's the sense that no matter how hard you optimize, how many extra hours you put in, how disciplined you are, the finish line for actually building something significant with your own labor keeps receding, because the system was never really designed to let that finish line arrive. Which brings us back to the person as a resource idea, because now we can actually see why it matters. If a human being is treated as an input to be optimized at work, and simultaneously treated as a revenue stream to be tapped at every transaction outside of work, then from both directions, employer and state, the same underlying logic is operating. You are valuable in a proportion to what can be extracted from you, not in proportion to what you are. That's a strange thing to live inside of. And I don't think most people consciously articulate it that way. But I think it's exactly what people mean when they say something like, what's even the point here? It's not laziness. It's a fairly accurate read of the incentive structures they're embedded in. Now, let's add the piece that I think turns this from uncomfortable into genuinely anxiety producing. And that's the instability of the promise on the other end. For most of the last century, the deal, implicit, never quite written down, but understood, was something like work for decades, pay into the system, defer a significant amount of your own present enjoyment, and at the end of it, there's retirement waiting for you. A period where the extraction stops and you finally just get to exist. Here's the strange thing. Across an enormous number of countries right now, the retirement age keeps getting pushed further out. Not once as an emergency correction, repeatedly as a reoccurring policy tool. Almost like a lever that gets pulled every time the underlying mass stops working. And each time it happens to a generation that already adjusted their entire life plan around the previous number. It's a moving target that only ever moves in one direction. So what happens to a person's psychology when they start to suspect, reasonably, based on actual observed patterns, that the terms will keep changing until the finish line simply outlives them? I think what happens is that anxiety stops being a response to a specific threat and becomes something closer to the ambient temperature. Not I'm afraid of this particular thing, just a low, constant fear of not being able to fully trust that the future will honor what the present is being asked to sacrifice for it. Anxiety used to be a response to danger. Now, for a lot of people, it's just the operating temperature of a normal life. So let's put the threads together, because I think there's actually one thread, not three. A system that talks about people as human resources is a system that has quietly decided people are instrumentally valuable. Valuable for what they produce. A tax structure that touches income at every stage of his life, in a system that ensures very little of that produced value ever becomes something a person can fully call their own. Something they can use to actually build a significant, self-directed life. And the retirement promise that keeps sliding further away is the final piece. It tells you that even the deferred version of that reward, the one you were promised at the very end of all that extraction, cannot be counted on either. Put those three together and you get something genuinely corrosive to the human spirit. And I don't think that phrase is an exaggeration. Not because any single piece of it is unreasonable in isolation. Taxes fund real things, companies need to measure output, pension systems do have to adjust to demographics. The corrosion isn't in one of the pieces. It's in what all three pieces communicate together, cumulatively, to a person living inside them. That they are, in the end, a means, a resource. An input whose output gets measured, whose surplus gets collected, and whose eventual reward can be renegotiated at any point by the people who will never have to explain the change to your face. What kind of person does that produce? I think it produces something who has learned correctly not to fully trust the long arc of their own effort. Someone who optimizes for the short term, not out of impatience, but out of accumulated evidence that the long term keeps getting rewritten by people with more leverage than they have. That's not a character flaw. That's a rational adaptation to an environment that has, again and again, demonstrated its own unreliability. We call people resources because we've stopped believing their ends. And maybe the first act of resistance available to any of us isn't a policy change or a protest. It's simply refusing internally to accept that description of yourself, insisting quietly and stubbornly that you are not the input, you are the point. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.